today we're going to talk about memory. We're going to talk about digital memory. We're going to talk about analog memory. We have a little bit of time. We're going to start the discussion on human memory, although we are going to have a little bit of an introduction to human memory up front. This is a quote from a guy named George Nagy. He was born in 1937. And two of the three reading assignments are papers that he published. He wrote, "We have accompanied the reader." This is a quote from one of his papers. So you can get an idea of how things were written, maybe. And this paper is not a recent paper. It says, "We have accompanied the reader into the labyrinth of pattern recognition, pointed out some of the salient landmarks, and offered battle on their behalf to the minotaur of semantic difficulties. We hope that we have given them enough strength to encourage them to return." So this is from a scientific paper. And I can tell you that I've read a lot of scientific papers, and they don't tend to be written or accepted if you write them like this anymore, which is a shame, because I thought this was kind of nice. So this was in 1968. Homework, as I mentioned, will be due on schedule. I'm going to make the time midnight for this homework. Normally it's noon. I don't know why, but it just seems like you guys like to do things last minute at night. So I'm going to give you that extra night, which will give you also 2 more office hours. Since it's kind of a short week, the homework's not up yet, but it'll be up soon. So I'll have my regular office hours Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning. In case you need any help, remember there's Piazza. Great, so we're going to talk about artificial and human memory over the next couple of classes. This is a summary of a paper. This is one of the 3 papers that you're going to read. And it says, "Widespread and persistent interest in the implementation of multi-level logic, conditional probability computers, learning machines, and brain models has created a need for an inexpensive analog or quasi-digital storage element." And it goes on to say there's a number of approaches to these problems that are going to be discussed in the paper. So this is talking about learning machines, machine learning, and brain models, neural networks or brain models. So it's talking about artificial intelligence and an interest in this area. What year do you think this was written? Oh, yeah. He was born in 37. Well, you won't be shocked to know it was 1962 in a paper called "A Survey of Analog Memory Devices." Now, if you're in computer science, you don't really hear too much about analog memory devices, although they do exist. We'll talk a little bit about it in this class because analog memory devices are perhaps more similar to the stuff that you have in your brain that you use for memory as well. Even though in neural networks, we like to think that maybe the neurons fire and don't fire, and that sort of sustenance of everything in your brain, you'll find out over the next couple of classes that there's a lot more stuff going on in your brain. Okay, here's another paper. It says, "McCullough and Pitts are often credited with the first, in 1943, mechanistic interpretation of the neuron doctrine. It was not until the 1960s, however, that neural networks emerged as a significant subdiscipline with attempts at application to engineering problems." So this was written when? Long time ago. Yes. Good though, 1991. So fairly recently, or before all of you were born, probably. The other paper, by the way, was written before I was born. But so this gentleman, after working with some of the original people working on neural networks and publishing a paper in the 60s, now in 1991, is writing a retrospective, basically looking 30 years back on what was happening then. And what you'll see is there's all this enthusiasm that's going on. If you look at the bottom of that paragraph, it says, his work caught the imagination of the press and led to a wave of a word I can't pronounce activity that subsided at the end of that decade. So he's talking about in 1991, something that was going on in the 1960s about neural networks, machine learning, brain models, and how the press was all excited about these types of systems. So sometimes you'll hear people that have been around for a while talk about, well, neural networks, you know, we've gone through this before, and people get excited. There's definitely reasons, as you saw in your homework assignment, why there's reasons to be excited now, but I wanted you all to know at least that this wasn't something that was new. I bring these up in particular because these relate to architectures of not only computing processing, but also memory storage. And Navy is talking about analog memory storage, because that's what he was working on, and contrasting it now here to digital computer simulations in 1991. So at least back in the 60s, when people were looking at how brains work, they thought that to make a fast artificially intelligent computer, they would have to create analog memories that looked like more like the memories in the brain than digital memories might look like. So I just sent this guy an email to see if he was still around, and he actually responded back. So I'm sharing that here in class. So he's retired, but he wrote this back in response to an email I recently sent him about memory. And there's a couple things that I thought were interesting. I basically was asking him if he thought that like analog memories could come back to life and people might be interested in them again, now that neural networks work. He says, I agree with you that analog processes are fundamental to all physiological mechanisms. Then he goes on to talk about his student days. So now this is back in the 60s when he's working with Rosenblatt. And he shares with us at a late stage, a small digital computer was added to the control room of Rosenblatt's room-sized analog neural network speech understanding machine, if you will, to keep track of input and output to facilitate experimentation. It turned out the little computer could simulate any experiment faster than it could be run through the neural network that performed thousands of operations in a day. So even back in the 60s, they fairly quickly realized that a lot of the work they were doing in these very complex architectures weren't processing information faster than the rudimentary digital computers that were available at the time. So this is the reading. A little bit of a history of artificial intelligence, but not just so you can pick out names and things like that. I think that it's pretty clear that artificial intelligence is not, when we looked at Sophia and we think about some of the more challenging problems that are out there, that they're going to be disruptive thought processes and breakthroughs that engineers or computer people like yourselves are going to come up with. And it may involve taking a look back and thinking about things in a more fundamental, different way than we think about them right now. So I think it's good to go back and get comfortable with reading things that are written in a very different way, in a different era, because these were pretty bright people that were trying to solve the same kind of problems that we're still trying to solve today. So the first two are Navy. Ones were specific to analog memory, and then the other one's more so related to neural networks. Those were the abstracts you looked at. And then I want you to get through chapter 4, which is the origin of feeling in Dr. Feldman's book. And basically, if you get through those 3 and this class, you're going to have most of what you need to do the whole. When we talk about memory in humans, it means diving into the brain. And for a lot of reasons, it's very hard to dive into a brain. Because of that, psychologists or neuroscientists or other types of people that work with humans either work with brains of other types of beings, or they work with no longer functioning brains, or they get access to some behavior of someone who's gone through some sort of brain damage or something like that to try to understand what's going on in the brain. This is just a program that's available online. It's called Brain Explorer, that allows you to do a deep dive through the brain. What they did was basically sliced human brain, non-functioning one, to see what it looked like, and then mapped it up into here. One of the things to understand when you do that is that and you've probably figured this out already from Feldman's book, is that a lot of what makes us humans when we think, feel, and behave is not static. Meaning it's our brain and body collaborating and doing something. It's that act of doing that gives us some awareness. If we just freeze everything in time, we lose that act of doing. It's kind of like what we talked about in a previous class, where if you want to know how fast something's going, you need to know where it is, at least to 2 different places in time. So if we really want to understand what's happening in the brain, we need to understand what's happening in the brain while the brain is doing what it is doing, which creates that problem of how do you do that? How do you get access to what's happening in the brain? And the answer is not very well. So you'll find that a lot of things that really relate to what's happening inside the brain and how it works are not well understood. But this is cool if you're either bored and or interested. It's free. You can just go Brain Explorer as a project, and you can move the brain around. You click on different things here related to different parts of the brain, different types of cells, neurons, that sort of thing. And that was done by the Allen Institute. Allen is actually, you guys should know who Allen is. You know who Paul Allen is? Huh? Who is Paul Allen? Yes, he's the co-founder. I was going to say he's the Wozniak of Microsoft. Yeah, he's the co-founder. He's actually dead. He passed away last year. He was also the owner of the Seattle Seahawks. He kind of like Wozniak left earlier in the company, although Paul Allen became a philanthropist and did a lot of things with this. So I never met him personally, just through the news. Okay, so the brain to me is as fascinating and inspirational as it is discouraging, because of what we just talked about. When it's operating, it's very complex. There's biology, there's chemistry, there's electronics, there's physics, all of which is going on at a macro and micro level in your brain, which is causing you to be you and do all the things that you learned you can do in terms of processing information and having biases and using those concepts to generate simulated reality. All those wonderful things are done by this very complex thing we call the brain. There are approximately 80 billion neurons. And if you think that number is not correct, you're probably right, because if you go into literature, you'll find all sorts of scientific controversy as to whether there's 100 billion or 80 billion. There's a thought that there's a bunch of cells that people were counting as neurons that aren't really neurons. And that gives you an idea of just how little we actually know. You may recall from biology that there's 23 chromosomes that have been studied really from relatively few number of brains, although now that's changed somewhat with 23andMe and these types of kits that look into genes and whatnot. And so there's 25,000 genes that have been identified. And if you think we know exactly what all of those genes do. So, and then I mentioned this before, but I want to make it clear that what we have is more of a static picture of what's happening in the brain and a partial picture based on a few brains that have been literally sliced, frozen, and then sliced very, very thinly, then manually dyed and taken pictures of to look at things at the cellular level and then pieced together in a computer image map similar to what I showed you. And that's where that map comes from that kind of work, slicing work. Okay. Yeah?
Why does it says all dead?
All dead? Oh, because I'm talking here about the Allen Institute brain map. So that map is from a dead brain. Yeah, so we, ideally, if we wanted to know what a brain does, we would let it do things and observe it while it's doing those things. But when we create these maps, everything's frozen in time. So it's like taking a picture. It's like taking a picture and saying, okay, what's happening here, right? Without knowing what's happening before with all those 80 billion neurons and everything around it, or what's happening after, or a little bit after. There's a neat, I don't know if iPhone does this, but in the Samsung phone, when you take a picture now, it saves images, sort of a little bit before and a little bit after your picture. So if you just take a regular picture, that regular picture might be 4 megabytes normally, but instead it's a compressed image that's maybe 10 megabytes. And in that 10 megabytes, it has basically like 1.5 to 3 seconds of your life around when it took the picture. Does iPhone do that?
Yeah, the live photo.
What's it called?
Live photo.
Live photo. So just a photo.
And you can see what happens before and after.
Okay. So I'll explain how that works in a little bit, in case you don't know how that works. Okay, so despite a lot of progress in understanding at least the physical structure of the brain and some of its chemical composition in terms of its DNA and genes, and some about the biochemistry there. There's a lot we don't know. We don't really know how human memory really works. We don't know how memories are encoded. We don't know how memories are stored and the role of the neurons in that process. Also, in addition to those billions of neurons, there's billions of other cells that are also in the brain. And we're not really sure what the role of all of those cells is in memory. And then the partitioning or coexistence of processing data, meaning what we talked about, sort of think of a computer, that there's a computer processor that's crunching through numbers doing math to process instructions. And then we have data. We don't really know how those things are separated or to what degree they're separated in the brain. And these photos are a good example of not separating processing and data very well to take advantage of that to do cool stuff. All right, so artificial memory, digital and analog. We'll start with digital computer memory. These are things we all take for granted. We kind of expect that if we store a file and we call it that file later, it's going to be exactly the same file. And if we send that file over the internet to someone else's computer and they open it up, we expect it's going to be the exact same file, or at least the exact same information that's within the file. We don't expect it's going to change and get a little fuzzy if the computer hard drive's a little bit. But maybe it'll break and it can't read the file anymore, but we don't expect it to change. And this is because the data are encoded in ones and zeros that remain there for the most part. And there's areas that are written to store these ones and zeros, which are really electrical charges and voltages. When you retrieve it, you go back to those areas and you pull these ones and zeros out. And then that data is decoded. I want to make sure I'm not suggesting that when you transmit a signal, there isn't bits that get lost and changed. That does happen. And because that does happen, when you transmit things, you encode the information in there in a way that you can tell if any of that's happened, so that you can either resend it. You can resend it if you need to resend it, or you can do with that packet what it is that you want. So transmission isn't necessarily always perfect. And then there are memories that are short-term and long-term memories. DRAMs, which are the volatile memories in the computer. Those are the memories when you turn it off, they're going to go away. And then the non-volatile memories, like your hard drive or your flash memory, is going to stick around. And they have a lot of different things you can use memories for. Does the image that you're seeing there have to store all of the image pixel data? Huh? You can compress it, right? And then normally you do compress it, right? Anything that's a JPEG image is going to be a compressed image. And just qualitatively, not worrying about the JPEG algorithms or the code that encodes in that way. What about the image do you think would allow you to store the image so that you didn't have to store every single pixel? And a pixel is basically every single square here in the value of the light of every single square. So what about that particular picture do you think would allow you not to have to store every pixel?
So if you look at the picture, there are certain areas that have the same colors verticals. I think that you can store like an average of what colors in an area, or in this case, pixel color. And then when you decompress the images, you can populate this pixel with that average or something similar.
That's exactly right. So there are some things that even though they're in a different area, they're fairly similar. What else? Let's just assume no one had ever compressed an image and we were fast and we continue to figure this out.
I think there's something called like pooling in image processing that you basically can say a picture and you just divide it in a matrix and you like put one or zeros depending if it's a color or not, so you can compress it that way. I think that's how can you like optimize it.
Very good. There's one more which relates to changes over area, which is to say that if my signal, either my color or my intensity, isn't changing very much as I move in some direction, then I can interpolate. I can store a point here and then store a point here, and literally just like fill these in with what creates a continuous change from here to here. So if this is blue and this is kind of blue, then I can go back to all those different shades of blue and do a gradient here to get from this blue to this blue. And then the eye presumably doesn't choose these.
That's why when you like contrast, you start working with it, and some sections will change automatically. Say that maybe all of the walls will change color because they're the same.
So now, let's say this image is 4 megabytes. I don't actually know what it is. Let's say we stored it, compressed, and it was 4 megabytes. And then we took another picture, which was this picture, and we stored it and compressed because of the algorithm. It's going to compress also to 4 megabytes. So now I have 2 pictures that are 4 megabytes. This is pretty much how your cameras work. So whenever you take a bunch of pictures that look kind of exactly the same, you take 1, 2, 3. You're storing the C files that have 4 megabytes or whatever it is that are in there. Setting aside for a moment, what do you call it, smart image or motion image?
Image processing.
Setting that aside for a second, if you just take a regular picture, it would be 4 megabytes, or whatever it is.
So we take something.
So what if you wanted to, if you had some new innovation, you said, wait a minute, this seems kind of wasteful, because a lot of the pictures people take look just like the other picture. You take 2 or 3, but they're in the same area, and they kind of look the same like this. What I do is when I'm on an airplane trip, and I don't have any Wi-Fi, because I rarely sleep, I just delete. I go through and I delete. And I literally, if I've got 3 of the same picture, I look at all 3 and see which one I like the best. And is everybody smiling in one? And do I look goofy in one? That one. And then I save one. Right? Well, should I really have to do that? What if a class like this who understands memory said, but now let's take a look at these 2 pictures. How would we store these 2 pictures if we wanted to store the 2 pictures not using anything? Or what are some of the similarities that you see in the pictures that you think could give us this new multi-picture great text compression? That word that it's like. It's not a trick question.
They look the same.
They look the same. Okay, that's really good. But you can kind of see how if you use some algorithms, you can take advantage of some of the similarities in the 2 pictures to maybe save one picture and then construct the other picture from the first picture with some additional information. That's basically how that works. So what happens is, at least in the Samsung one, which I'm more familiar with, that saves like 3 seconds. Well, it's not a video that's saving. It's actually saving. It's taking multiple pictures, but it's using these similarities to be able to reconstruct a picture that's a little bit away from this picture by storing the information here and adding a little bit more. And then saying, well, how do I get to this next picture from adding a little bit more information to that? And that's why instead of having say, 30 pictures that slice 3 seconds, for example, at a tenth of a second, that would then be 30 times 4 megabytes, or 120 megabytes. They have maybe 4 going up to 10 megabytes. So just by adding basically 2.5 pictures worth of memory, they can create 3 seconds of reality, simulated reality. Simulating a simulated reality. So, why don't we see if we can apply what we just learned to what we think might be going on in the human brain. Yes.
Some memories might have to do with each other.
Some memory might have something to do with another memory.
Yeah, like for example, when you meet someone, you could say like, oh, you look like, let's say, this uncle I had.
That's exactly right. And if that uncle you had, and that person was there, right next to each other, probably see that they look different.
Yeah, but they would have some similarities, and then, like, for example, when you come to your uncle, for example, like, say, like, I have an uncle that looks like you, and you can say, you can see my uncle, oh, you look like my professor.
Looks like a pattern recognition.
Yeah.
It's like the illusion of love. The meaning of it, it's just a lot of the meaning is going to be.
Like they look at the law. So it's probably not the case then, probably, I can't prove this, because we don't know how the brain works, right? It's probably not the case that you have remembered every single instant, even if you divide it up into, say, some number of times per second, or even just a second. Let's just say every second of since I walked into this classroom, you probably haven't remembered. But if I ask you, so you haven't stored, every single second or sampling every single second, but who here remembers me walking in dripping wet? So do you really think that you remember drops? So you think you stored an image of me with a drop on my a video. So you took a video. So this, I think, actually where some of the still imaging technology is going, thanks to Harry Potter, is actually pretty interesting. Because it's one thing in the past, we looked at videos in separate frames that have all the data, and then we're trying to save it by compressing those at the time. And then images which are clearly discrete, we're trying to compress those. And now applications like the iPhone, like the Samsung, I'm sure there's others, where you're trying to basically construct the way things that really not necessarily existed or didn't exist exactly like, right? It's kind of a trade-off. If you want it to exist exactly like it, you can't compress it all. The idea behind compression is it's loss and you will lose information. It's just you think that your algorithms that we tend to use have been developed so that the human can't really see the difference. It's basically unless, of course, you blow it up and print it, and then you can say, hey, this isn't, it's nice as I thought it was. And so that's why if you are going to print out things in big, a lot of times you can't use that compressed file because that information that you lost, now you're going to see that it's lost. It's not actually there. You didn't save the file. Really good, actually.
Yeah, that also happens in SAM on files because if you store the original digital song that you buy. Normally they sell you a higher format than MP3 because it contains more data, more information of the original song than what MP3 has.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for sharing. So I actually I don't think this exists. It would be good to know if it does. So here's the application. It's to say it's different than what we were talking about with iPhone motion. It's just to say if I've just got a whole bunch of pictures, and I know that a lot of pictures are kind of similar, why don't I just play this trick basically? And I'm not going to save 8 megabytes. Even though I took these two pictures separately, 4 and 4, I'm going to save them so they look like 2 distinct files. Right? But they're not going to take 8 megabytes, they're going to take maybe 4.1 megabytes. Because as long as this file is here, I can recreate this one. So I can just show you that you have 2 distinct files. Now, the only trick you have to do is if someone goes to delete this file, right? If you're building this file based on this file, then you need to sort of grab that data back out and then delete it. But that's easy to do. So when you delete a file, you don't really actually delete the file. Just lose the pointer. Unless you're a smart computer scientist. And you go to write that so that you make sure you always want to write a file. Don't let anybody just throw away the pointer. We're wondering why people like on the news and say, well, they went back and all the data was there. It's because you don't actually delete a file. Just delete the pointer. And you restore the pointer to the file, or if you just go look at things that look like files.
In the iPod, now on the iPhone also they do that, and if you there's a glitch that not always happens, but if you scroll images too fast, you can see deleted images because it confuses pointers and brings back a picture that it's supposed to be deleted.
Okay, so we showed this in the digital world, but we're using it to kind of think about how it might be realistic that we can construct something that's a construction of something else that we kind of saved because it kind of looked like something else. Different here in these examples is that whereas the Samsung or the iPhone are doing it based on saving something that's a little bit further in time, right? Maybe we do that in something that's way further in time. Right? I've seen the professor a bunch of times. I don't need to remember him and store him every single time he's been here. Right? How many can you imagine me, remember me on exam day? Was I over here?
Say no.
What color shirt did I have? When I was reviewing the exam, the last session before the exam, what color shirt did I have?
I have white, black, and dark blue stripes.
You're a guess.
I actually did have the dark blue flowery stripe shirt. No, so I think you see the point, right? Whereas we think that we remember, and I did have a black shirt, probably you didn't save every single instance of that either, because you didn't need to. For the purposes that you've learned in life, you didn't really need to remember a lot of what happened. We talked about this earlier in class. When we were talking about not understanding something sometimes being better than understanding something in class. Because if you understand something in class, the HSI model says that it's coming from my consciousness to your consciousness, And you're like, I know that already. And then that means it just flies away. You already know it. And so if you didn't really know it, it just made sense to you, and you didn't do anything to interact with your subconscious to remember it, then the next time you go to learn it, you might not remember it because it made sense to you when you heard it. And so the irony of, hey, if it actually doesn't make sense to me and I don't get it, there's maybe a higher likelihood that I'm going to remember it in the exam than if it made too much sense to me when I heard it, because it's just similar to what I've heard before, so I don't actually need to do anything to remember.
Yeah, I believe that it's like in the book, she calls emotions constructive emotions because we interpret the world and add part of us, like let's say, and constructive interpretation of what is happening and where we make the emotion. I think it's the same for the when you remember something, you are not actually taking all memories back, but you are making a mix of that with a guess, and you are trying to make a picture in your head, sort of imagining it, and like filling the lines with the compression algorithm, but also because I remember you sitting there, but instead of remember you, I remember the exam sitting next to you. But when I remember the exam, I can remember you and imagine what you have and guess that it was black. And little details.
Excellent. Actually, I created this slide just half hour before we came because I was looking at class from last year and I wanted to pull this concept in. So I'm glad I did it because I feel like from the discussion, if you've been able to follow along, we've actually done a really good job in sort of bringing these two worlds together, psychology / physiology and computer science. So when you start thinking about how a computer can possibly process all of this data that it's going to have when you guys figure out how to put sensors inside, outside, throughout, of all different kinds so that it can run and not fall, I think one of the secrets is that you aren't going to store everything. You're not going to store a perfect image hundreds or thousands of times per second for the entirety of that robot's existence, because at least you don't need it if what your goal is to create something that's human, because we don't need it. So I don't know, it would be interesting to know how far people have taken this concept of like the 3 seconds from one picture, 4 megabytes to 10 megabytes, into thinking about how to do memory management within an Android or artificial intelligence game. So this is the structure of memory. Basically, in a computer, there's internal main primary memory that's on the left. There's external memory. There's different kinds of memory, read-only memory, RAM memory, which is volatile memory. External memory are things like your disks, thumb drives, hard disk drives. And all of these types of memories combine to give you the experience that you have on a computer. There's even memory on your graphic card. So you can do rendering quickly if you're gaming and that kind of stuff. So there's memory everywhere throughout the computer. How that memory is used depends on what you're trying to do with the computer. But one of the things that the computers typically do is they use a, and I say cache, some people say cache, say cache memory, and then a main memory, And it's actually more complicated than that. But just simplistically, what you want to do with your cache is try to guess as to what the user is going to need, so you don't have to go to get it in main memory. Because if you get it from main memory, it's going to be slower, and it's going to consume more energy. So to the extent that you have algorithms, and people are constantly working on these types of things to try to guess correctly, then you can grab it from the cache, and then it'll be faster. When I say cache is actually not like your grandmother's cache. Basically, it's just going to be a cache. Like, it's a little bit more complicated in and of itself. So here's a cache where there's actually 3 layers. One layer, the first one that you get to here, it says this core would be like your microprocessor core. So if you have a computer that has multiple cores, each one of those can have access to a L1 cache. And what is in there is actually not just data that you might need, not just a file you just looked at that you might need, but also instructions that you might need, an application that you might need, maybe a Java application. Okay. So to the extent the core can pull something that's already there, then it's going to be able to move fairly quickly. If not, it goes to the L2, which is mixed and shared. So L2 could have instructions or data for the core 1 or core 2. And then you have L3, which is an interface to the DRAM, which is the non-volatile memory. That you go to if it's not an L2. So multiple layers of cache. If you can't remember something right away, you're going to have to spend some time to go find it. So now looking at analog memory, I should ask actually, because I'm electrical engineering and computer scientist, and I know you all don't do a lot of electrical engineering and computer science normally. But are you comfortable with the difference between analog and digital? If I asked you right now in front of the class to explain it, would you all be able to do it? Okay. So, good. Thanks for answering that. So, and feel free to always stop me if I'm assuming things, because sometimes I do that. Digital literally means just, for the most part, a 1 or 0. So information is stored as a bit. It's either a 0 or a 1, which means in the electronics, it's at 1 charge value or 1 charge value or 1 voltage value and another voltage. Those voltage values aren't necessarily 0 and 1. In fact, they're not 0 and 1. Normally, they're just 2 different values. And because we can construct information by putting a bunch of 0s and 1s together, right? Like we can construct color blue and hexadecimal, hexadecimal just being a combination of 4 0s and 1s, right? Then basically we can construct anything from 0s and 1s. And because computers can do math really fast on 0s and 1s, all the complex software that you write can be compiled and converted to computations on 0s and 1s, and that's what a digital computer is. Basically, digital computers very, very, very quickly do very, very, very simplistic math. Unless it's these new quantum computers that Google is experimenting with, which do very complex math very quickly. Analog just means that it's not 0s and 1s. Basically, it's a continuous world. So if I have a signal that's varying from some amount to some other amount, in the digital world, I have to have a quantitative number for each amount. In the analog world, I don't do that. It's just whatever that number happens to be. But to get from an analog world to a digital world, I have to sample that analog signal, and every one of those samples I'm going to convert into some value of zeros and ones. So that's why it's digital. So the thing is, you can do math. You don't have to convert things to digital, even though all modern computers do. You can do math on analog signals. So you don't have to convert things to digital. When I say convert, the reason I say convert is because the world is analog. It's not digital. We live in an analog world. But when we use our cameras, we have this analog world and we have to convert it into a digital world. Otherwise, we can't really deal with it. We can't store it into a file. We can't compress it. We can't send it to somebody else. When you have microphone, it's the same thing. But in the good old days, it wasn't like that. Even the first cellular phones that were in common use, which were in the 90s in common use, those weren't digital. Those were digital phones inside, but the signals that they sent were analog signals. That's called amps. And the phones on the other side picked up analog signals with analog information that they had to convert down to lower frequencies where they can convert it to digital and do some digital signal processing. Now it's all advanced, so now even the signals going out are digital, which is why we can get a lot more information. So the world is analog. Our brains are analog. Our bodies are analog. Everything around us is analog. So that's why it begs this question of, if we want to get to some level of artificial general intelligence, are we at some point going to have to get back somewhat to analog signal processing? Or are we going to be able to do everything in the digital domain? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's why I'm having you read at least those 2 articles on analog. And so at least that you know this real analog world exists out there, because at some point you may need it. You may need to think differently about a problem in order to solve it. Ooh, I didn't expect to see that. Okay, this is a human heart cross section. It has a right atrium that receives deoxygenated blood from the body and transfers to the right ventricle. All of you know how your heart works, right? Who knows how their heart beats? Who doesn't know? I love this question because I'm in the same scenario. Like when I look at this, I kind of know the right words I'm supposed to say. I know a lot more about the heart because I had an electrical problem with my heart a few years ago. And when you have problems with your heart, you learn about your heart. But it's interesting, something that is so fundamentally important to us, which we carry around with us all the time, which we rely on to do its work, it's there. I don't need to really know about it, right? But the way the heart works is it's got different chambers and it's got different valves, and it's got muscles around it with electrical signals that cause the muscles to contract. And if they just do all this all at the same time, pretty much. You have to do like this coordinated dance of like bringing stuff in, and this expands and this contracts, and it's all electrical. If your electrical goes off, like you go. That's what happened to me actually. So I used to have a little short circuit in my electrical. And so sometimes they would do this, and then all of a sudden one of them would just start dancing. Yeah, it's not good. Thankfully, what they did is something very sophisticated, which is they went in, some more tubes and stuff that are there, and burned part of my heart. So literally burned it. That's the sophistication. But what that did is it increased the electrical resistance where they burnt it, so the signals weren't, the current wasn't able to go through, they had no ground. So it wasn't able to short circuit. So it's actually been working fine for about 5 years. So anyway, this is an electrical thing. It's a biological thing. It's got biochemistry, right? It's got oxygen coming in the blood. There's all sorts of stuff that's really cool going on in the heart. The brain gets a lot of credit, but the heart is really important. This is an electrical signal that you may see if you've been to a hospital, either for yourself or someone else. And you look at that little monitor, you want to see something that looks like this. If your heart's doing all sorts of things, like it's a short circuit, it doesn't look like that. The different parts of that signal are showing you different times when it's expanding and contracting, that sort of thing. And so this is what it looks like. Sometimes it might jump around a little bit because you might move a little bit and little electrodes. So anybody have this? Put little electrodes on the thing and get the signal. It doesn't hurt or anything. When they pull it off, it hurts because it's sticky. But basically, what, yeah.
The Apple Watch, I think, also now has a I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be a little different because it's basically looking at something similar. I think so. Yeah, it might be the same.
I think the 4 and the 5.
They may actually create this from what they measure. That's the only doubt that I have. Because part of the trick here is you have your heart here and you look at certain things. You can also generate something that looks like it. Remember that? Like, take that risk of putting life in the body. You can also get it back. Talk about that. What if you were like in the 1960s and you were studying machine learning like Navy was, and you said, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to train the computer to tell me like which one of these signals is okay and which one of these signals is not. But it's something you can do today. You could do it. Go online and download ECG signals that were normal ECG signals. You can do all that stuff in Learn CoLab to get those signals into something that goes into the network. You can train it, and actually, it probably would do a pretty decent job. If you gave a new signal and said, someone had this person having this problem. And it's probably similar to what might be doing on the Apple Watch, at least it's on the rhythms going off or something like that. But what if you were in 1960? You have a small digital computer in the lab. What would you do if you wanted to train an artificial neural network? Could you do? Well, thankfully, they had analog computers in the 1960s, and you could, in fact, do machine learning if you didn't mind doing it in the analog. So this is a circuit. It's called an analog nonlinear filter. And if you look at the top, this was done in around 1967. Way older, probably more than 1967. It's old stuff. A physician electrocardiogram classification system that, according to this paper, they actually demonstrated to detect someone that was having a normal. This is what you watched here in 1960s, right? Someone that was having a normal rhythm, that person was 10, versus an abnormal, but they were 53% of the time abnormal. Meaning when they guessed it was abnormal, they were only half right. But what they came up with, that was the state of the art, but what they came up with was this analog matched filter. When you use this analog matched filter in an analog computer, it improved from abnormal from 53 to 90%. That means 9 out of every 10 times that you said this person's having a problem, right? This is actually pretty good back in the 1960s. This work was actually presented by Glenn Speck at the IEEE Pattern Recognition Workshop, which was held where? So the IEEE Pattern Recognition Workshop of 1966. So I just think this is cool. I could be the only one. How does it work? The way it works in the analog domain is you look for matches. Basically, you're building a filter like you would a digital filter, so you can actually build digital filters now. In MATLAB, I think lets you build digital filters, so you can write your own code. But in the analog world, you don't get to do that. And so you build these electronic analog circuits, but they basically work the same way. So it's matched in the frequency domain. So you take that signal that you have there, and you take an ideal signal, and you Fourier transform it, essentially, which puts it into the frequency domain. But you don't get to do a fast Fourier transform because it's digital. You do an actual Fourier transform with analog circuits, so it's like real math, longhand math, and you match it. And basically, it's going to create an output that's really high if the signal coming in matches in the frequency. If it doesn't match, it's going to create an output that's really low. And so basically, that's how they would do it effectively at 0 or 1, a decision that says this is abnormal or this is not abnormal, based on how much energy came out the other side when they put this ECG signal coming in. So this is what I just said, but in pictures. Analog EEG signals coming in. Switch the letter there on. To an analog match signal, and then an analog signal coming out that if the analog signal is low, then it's abnormal. If it's high, then it's normal. So what did this thing look like? Didn't look like that, but it could have looked like that. I actually couldn't find a picture of that one. This is something else. This is what you see now. One of the big, somebody may work for this company. I don't remember if it was Lockheed or one of these companies is telling me that they have 300 engineers working on doing pattern recognition of images for targeting. And so the idea is basically to identify things that are down there automatically. So this is a system that was essentially doing not that, but like a very low level of that. Back in 1945, and what it was trying to do was basically figuring out when to let go of the bomb so that it would hit the target that it was supposed to hit. But remember, there were no digital computers in 1945. If you saw that movie, they were working on computers in the 40s to solve codes, right? So they were imitation, right? But they didn't have this. This is actually an airplane, an analog computer that was being used to calculate based on the wing velocity, the speed of the plane, where the target was, when to drop it. So that's what an analog computer actually looks like. And I think this may actually have been the first analog computer, maybe the first one that actually did something in a product.